Compliance, the final frontier. Tom Fox is the voyager of trekking through compliance. His mission? To explore the original series and seek out and share what it can teach you about compliance. Here's your host, Tom Fox.
Episode 11, The Menagerie, Stardate 3012.4. The Menagerie, Stardate 3012.4. This episode and its sequel were derived from the original pilot for the Star Trek series, The Cage. The Enterprise diverts to Starbase 11 after Spock reports receiving a subspace message from the former captain of the Enterprise, Christopher Pike. However, the Commodore on the Starbase tells him Pike has been injured from exposure to delta rays and could not have sent the message. This is confirmed when Kirk and Spock are shown that Pike is confined to a wheelchair, which is operated by brainwaves. The only communication of which Pike is capable is signaling yes and no. Pike refuses to speak to Bones or Kirk, but agrees to speak to Spock in private. Spock, who had served under Pike for 11 years, prepares to mutiny in order to take him to Talos 11, despite his protest. Meanwhile, an investigation of tapes reveals that Spock received no such transmission, but Kirk refuses to believe it is possible that Spock could have been responsible for the deception. Spock commandeers Pike. They go aboard the Enterprise. The Enterprise warps out. Kirk and Mendez pursue Spock, and the Enterprise stops and beams Kirk and Mendez aboard just as their shuttlecraft is about to run out of fuel. Spock informs them that he has set up the ship's computer so that it cannot be disengaged without terminating life support until the Enterprise reaches Talos 4. Spock is then put on trial. Not only is it a mutiny, which is a court-martial offense, but visiting Talos 4 is an offense punishable by death. The hearing proceeds because Pike is still listed on active duty, so 3 command officers, as required by regulations, are present. During the hearing, Spock introduces a recording of the experiences of the original crew of the Enterprise on Talos 4. The tape recounts how 13 years previously, the Enterprise, commanded by Pike, received a distress signal from the survey vessel Columbia, which had been lost some 18 years earlier. Unbeknownst to the landing party, their actions were being monitored by the native Talosians. The Doctor notices that the condition of the survivors is better than could have been reasonably expected and becomes suspicious. Before he can find out what's going on, Vina leads Pike into a Talosian trap. As soon as Pike is drugged and captured by the Talosians, the survivors, who were all illusionary, vanish. In a desperate attempt to rescue Pike, the landing party tries to blast through the rock to which Pike was spirited away, but their phasers have apparently no effect. At this juncture, Uhura pipes in to report that the Enterprise has been receiving transmissions directly from Talos 4, and Kirk has been relieved of duty by order of Starfleet Command, and Commodore Mendez is ordered to take control of the Enterprise. That's the end of part 1. So, fun fact, Robert Justman convinced Gene Roddenberry to write a 2-part series utilizing the first pilot because they ran out of scripts in the middle of the season and would have had to have shut down production otherwise. So, sometimes cost cutting can lead to great series. So, what are some of the compliance takeaways from this episode? Well, in an early scene involving Christopher Pike, it's clear that Pike is on the verge of not a nervous breakdown, but perhaps exhaustion. And it means that as a CCO and as a compliance professional, you have to take care of yourself. Sometimes you have to step back and take a rest. Sometimes it might be doing something other than compliance for a little bit, perhaps a sabbatical, but perhaps spending your free time away from the office. I recognize that many of the jobs we all have are certainly 24/7, but you have to take care of yourself. You have to eat right. You have to exercise. You have to do all those things your mother told you to do. So a leader must take care of themselves because, frankly, you're no good to your employees, to your compliance folks, to the corporation, to the people who depend on you if you're not at the top of your game. Second, And I found this really interesting analogy. When something is too good or appears to be too good or too good to be true, it usually is too good to be true. And if you think about this in the compliance context, it relates to business transactions. If you have a business transaction that has an incredibly high profit margin, it means it is because there is some inherent risk in the deal. Now, that risk could be violation of the FCPA, bribery and corruption risk, but there are a wide variety of other business risks. There's weather risk, there's competition risk, there's climate risk, there's geopolitical risk, risk from competitors, risk in the difficulty of the project, wide variety of risks. But if you have a very high profit margin, this is something that you need to consider from the compliance perspective, because if that profit margin was so great, is it because someone paid a bribe to get a government official to sign off on a truly invidious and insidious contract? So if something is too good to be true and the profit margin is so high, it may be an indicia of other problems. Here, we only need to look at Goldman Sachs and their bond offerings in 1MDB, where even Goldman Sachs internally thought the profit margin was too high. And if you have a profit margin that high, it means that somebody is rushing to get something done. Now, there's certainly business reasons for doing that, but once again, it may also be another reason. And then finally, every compliance officer needs to memorize this phrase. And of course, it comes from Ronald Reagan, but it still holds true. Trust but verify. And that was really true of the crash survivors of the Columbia on the planet Talos. Just as the doctor was running some preliminary medical scans to see how they were, he noticed that they were all in perfect health. And he couldn't understand how, having lived 18 years as basically survivors of a crash, they could have been in that sort of condition. So how did they maintain that condition? It certainly was an indicia that something was not right. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow, where we take up part 2 of the Menagerie.
If you enjoyed this episode of Trekking Through Compliance, you can help it grow by sharing it with the biggest Trek fan you know.